Palestine and Israel, two names that have echoed through decades of conflict, news headlines, and international debate. Many would have you believe it's a simple story, a relentless cycle of rocket attacks, a quarrel over real estate, or even a centuries-old religious dispute. Yet beneath these surface narratives lies a far more complex history, one that stretches back over a century, filled with promises, betrayals, and political maneuvering. Understanding the roots of this story is essential, for it reveals why the struggles of today are inseparable from the events of the past. The story begins in 1916, at the height of the First World War, when the world was engulfed in chaos. The Ottoman Empire, a vast and enduring dominion that had lasted over 6 centuries, was on the verge of collapse. Its territories spanned the Middle East, yet internal divisions and external pressures had left it vulnerable. Meanwhile, the British and French were plotting the post-war map of the region. They approached the Arabs with promises of independence, sovereignty, and leadership over the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant, asking only for military support in defeating the Ottomans. The Arabs, longing to free themselves from Ottoman rule, agreed. They saw this as a chance to govern their own lands, to claim the independence that had been denied to them for centuries. They fought, sacrificing lives and resources, believing that in victory lay the promise of self-determination. But what they did not know was that the Europeans had a far different plan. The Arabs were about to be deceived, their hopes manipulated for strategic gain by powers more concerned with influence than principle. Behind closed doors, Britain and France met in secret and devised a plan that would forever alter the Middle East. This covert arrangement, known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, divided the lands of the fallen Ottoman Empire into zones of European control and influence. Britain would claim Palestine, Jordan, and southern Iraq, while France would dominate southeastern Turkey, northern Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. The Arabs, who had fought loyally for freedom, were blindsided by this betrayal. When news of the secret agreement reached the Arab leaders, the shock was profound. They realized that their struggle had been exploited. Their dream of independence was replaced with colonial oversight. Instead of self-rule, they were handed European dominion. The sense of betrayal would echo for generations, shaping the mistrust and tension that still lingers in the region today. While the full story of this deception is vast and intricate, the seeds of future conflict were already being sown. Meanwhile, in Europe, a separate but equally consequential movement was gaining momentum. The Zionist movement, advocating for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, had grown increasingly influential. Through persistent lobbying and political maneuvering, the Zionists sought international recognition for Jewish claims to the land, pushing for large-scale immigration from Europe. Their efforts would soon intersect with British ambitions, setting the stage for an unprecedented and controversial decision. In 1917, Britain made a public declaration that would shock the region. With the Balfour Declaration, the British government announced its intention to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. A land that was overwhelmingly Palestinian, over 90% of its population, was now promised to European Jews, essentially gifted as if it were a box of chocolates. Historians to this day debate the motivations behind this decision, questioning how and why Britain could make such a momentous choice, ignoring the majority population of the land entirely. At the time, the Jewish population in Palestine was small, representing less than 10% of the total inhabitants. Yet, under British auspices, the stage was set for dramatic demographic changes. Between 1922 and 1935, Britain actively facilitated the immigration of European Jews into Palestine, causing the Jewish population to rise to nearly 27%. The influx brought not only people, but also political influence, as European settlers increasingly claimed land and resources that had long belonged to Palestinian families. The native Palestinian population grew alarmed. Their warnings and protests to the British authorities were largely ignored, as European Jewish settlements continued to expand. The British, tasked with governing the mandate, often favored Zionist interests, even proposing forced relocations of Palestinian families to make room for newcomers. These policies were intended to resolve tensions on paper, but in practice, they only deepened resentment, fostering a climate ripe for revolt and resistance. Palestinian opposition soon took a more confrontational form. Revolts erupted against British rule, driven by the frustration of dispossession and marginalization. These uprisings were met with brutal suppression, with thousands of Palestinians killed and countless more displaced. Yet, despite the violence and repression, the Palestinian people did not relent. They continued to resist, holding on to the hope that one day they might reclaim autonomy and security in their ancestral lands. By 1947, the British, exhausted by decades of conflict and unable to reconcile competing claims, decided to withdraw from Palestine entirely. They handed responsibility for the territory to the newly formed United Nations, essentially saying, "Here, deal with it." The UN, tasked with finding a solution, proposed a partition plan that would divide Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. On paper, the plan seemed balanced, but in reality, it heavily favored the Jewish population, which still comprised only 1/3 of the people living in Palestine at the time. Under the UN partition proposal, Jewish settlers were allocated 55% of the land, a stark contrast to their actual demographic presence. The Arabs, who had been living on the land for generations, viewed this as an unacceptable injustice. They rejected the plan outright, while Zionist leaders accepted it conditionally. Yet even then, they refused to agree to the boundaries set by the UN. Their acceptance was strategic, a stepping stone to further expansion. As 1948 approached, tensions escalated into open conflict. Zionist militias began attacking Palestinian villages and towns, displacing thousands of residents and seizing land before the British formally withdrew. This campaign was deliberate, aimed at consolidating territory for the future Israeli state. On the very day the British left, the Zionists proclaimed the establishment of Israel, effectively erasing the political presence of Palestinians overnight. Millions were left without homes, without lands, and without recognition. The day Israel was declared, May 14, 1948, marked the beginning of a new era for some, but a catastrophe for the Palestinian people. Almost overnight, the lives of millions were upended. Families were forced to abandon their homes, villages were emptied, and centuries-old communities were shattered. The Palestinians called this tragedy the Nakba, or catastrophe, a name that captures the depth of loss, displacement, and despair experienced by those who once called the land their own. The scale of destruction was staggering. Approximately 1.9 million Palestinians were expelled from their homes, and more than 78% of historic Palestine was taken from its native inhabitants. Over 530 villages and towns were systematically depopulated, destroyed, or repurposed to serve the new Israeli state. Alongside this physical destruction came a horrifying toll in human life, as thousands were killed in massacres and military operations designed to terrorize and displace. Yet the creation of Israel did not simply mean the loss of territory. It was the beginning of decades of systemic oppression. The Nakba was not a moment. It was a process that would unfold over generations. Palestinian identity, rooted in land and culture, was under threat. Those who survived the initial expulsions faced ongoing hardships: the confiscation of property, restrictions on movement, and constant uncertainty over their future. The international response was jarring. Despite the enormity of the displacement and violence, both the United States and the Soviet Union immediately recognized the new state of Israel. Political interests and Cold War calculations took precedence over justice for the dispossessed. The Palestinian people were left without meaningful support or recourse, forced to confront the reality that their homes and lands had been claimed by others with international approval. For the Palestinians, the loss was total. Homes, lands, and communities vanished almost overnight. The trauma of displacement was compounded by the erasure of cultural and social structures that had sustained generations. Families were scattered across refugee camps in neighboring countries, struggling to survive in conditions of poverty and uncertainty, clinging to memories of a homeland that had been stolen. Over the following decades, the occupation intensified. Israeli policies entrenched themselves through land seizures, home demolitions, and military checkpoints that restricted freedom of movement. Arbitrary arrests became routine, and systematic discrimination created a climate in which Palestinians faced constant insecurity. Expansion of settlements and the construction of walls further fragmented their communities, reinforcing the separation and control of their land. Bombings, massacres, and military operations continued to target civilians. Men, women, and children lived under constant threat, their lives dictated by checkpoints, curfews, and ongoing violence. The daily reality for Palestinians became one of fear and uncertainty, as the dreams of independence and safety were replaced with a struggle for survival under occupation. This is why the situation is not simply a complicated dispute over land or religion. It is the story of a people who have endured decades of dispossession, forced displacement, and systemic oppression. Understanding this history is crucial, for the conditions of today are a direct consequence of the injustices that began over a century ago. The history of Palestine reminds us that the narratives often presented in media and politics can oversimplify and distort reality. Behind every headline is a human story of suffering, resilience, and loss. It is a history of broken promises, failed diplomacy, and the relentless pursuit of rights denied. Each act of injustice feeds into a cycle of pain that reverberates across generations. Remembering this past is not just an academic exercise, it is an ethical responsibility. The Nakba, the expulsions, and the decades of occupation are not distant events. They continue to shape the lives of Palestinians today. To ignore this history is to risk repeating its mistakes, not just in Palestine, but anywhere in the world where power is exercised at the expense of human dignity. We must reflect on these events with honesty and empathy. The struggles of the Palestinian people are not abstract statistics. They are lived experiences of displacement, violence, and denial of basic rights. Recognizing their suffering is the first step toward justice and reconciliation, a recognition that demands both historical understanding and moral courage. In the end, this is a story of survival against overwhelming odds. Despite decades of dispossession, occupation, and marginalization, Palestinians continue to assert their identity, preserve their culture, and resist erasure. Their story is a testament to resilience, even in the face of systemic oppression and international indifference. May we learn from this history, ensuring that the pain endured by one people is not repeated elsewhere. And may the world acknowledge and work toward alleviating the suffering that continues to afflict Palestinian families.